Hello, everyone, and welcome to our track on setting. My name is David DeWeet, and I will be moderating this panel, coming at you live from beautiful Switzerland, the birthplace of Albert Hofmann. My personal background is in clinical psychology and cognitive neuroscience, and I currently work for Synthesis Retreats as a member of the health screening and psychological support team. Before this, however, during my studies, I did an internship in setting research at Imperial College under the tutelage of one of our speakers today, Dr. Mendel Kaelin, who coincidentally I met right here at ICPR in 2016. During this time, I also repeatedly came across the work of Dr. Ido Hartogson, and I was instantly fascinated by his alternative approach to explaining the effects of set and setting. As you might imagine, given the role that both of these speakers have played in my own research over the past few years, I'm very honored to be moderating for them. Setting, and particularly the physical, social, and cultural setting, has long been understood as an integral component in determining both the acute effects and the outcomes of a psychedelic experience. However, due to various ethical and logistical challenges regarding altering setting to be either more positive or negative, there's been very little research on this topic in recent years. And perhaps the one aspect of setting that has been studied more extensively in regards to its role in psychedelic therapy is music, the topic of our second talk. Few researchers, if any, have done more work on this than Dr. Mendel Kaelin, and his talk will provide an overview of the latest empirical research into the mechanisms and best practices of music in psychedelic therapy. But before we get ahead of ourselves, our first talk by Dr. Ido Hartogson will be discussing the dependency of psychedelic effects on the context in which these substances are taken. This talk will have a particular focus on the meaning-enhancing qualities of psychedelics and how these relate to enhancing the placebo effects. I'm sure you're all just as excited as I am to get started and hear more from these two influential researchers. So allow me to briefly introduce our first speaker, Dr. Ido Hartogson, Assistant Professor at the Program for Science, Technology, and Society at Bar-Ilan University. His research engages the historical, sociological, and cultural dimensions of the psychedelic experience with an emphasis on the role of set and setting. He will soon be publishing a book called The American Trip on how set and setting shape the American psychedelic experience, which explores the role of society and culture shaping psychedelic research. I'm personally quite curious to read this. So without further ado, let's jump in. Ido has prepared a pre-recorded presentation. So yeah, take it away.
Hello, my name is Ido Hartogson. I'm an assistant professor for science, technology, and society studies at Bar-Ilan University. And over the past decade, I've been studying psychedelics from the perspective of technology studies, focusing on the subject of set and setting, how set and setting shape experiences with psychedelics, not just for individuals, but for entire cultures. And this research recently culminated with the publication of this book, American Trip, published by MIT Press. And today's talk, I want to synthesize some of the key insights that emerged out of a series of free papers that I published over the past couple of years, and tie together three crucial issues: the idea of set and setting, the idea of psychedelics as meaning enhancers, and finally, how all of this relates to the placebo response and the broader medical potential of psychedelics. So first of all, what is set and setting? Well, if you've been interested in psychedelics, set and setting is a concept that you probably came across. It's basically the most recurring, most fundamental concept of psychedelic theory and psychedelic practice. And what it says really is that the character and outcome of a psychedelic experience depend first and foremost on two types of factors. First, internal psychological factors like intention, like expectation, mood, that's the set. Then external environmental factors like the physical, social context, who you're with during the experience, and the cultural context. What kinds of beliefs and attitudes does the culture have regarding hallucinations, regarding hallucinogens, and reality more generally? Now, these two things, the set and the setting, are together responsible for the spectacular variety of experiences that people have with psychedelics. And this runs all the way from the beautiful to the horrific, from the religious to the creative, from scarring to healing. And in American Trip, I look at 7 different schools that existed in the 1950s and 1960s, and I showed that these different schools arrived at very different experimental results, very different conclusions about the nature of the psychedelic experience. And this was really the result of very different types of set and setting that produced different responses in subjects. So the concept of set and setting has been with us since the early days of psychedelic research. It's central to psychedelic science, to understanding and interpreting the variety of psychedelic effects. And it's also central to psychedelic therapy, to optimizing these effects in treatment. It's a concept that's relevant for scientists, for mental health professionals, but it's also essential to lay people, to psychonauts, to whoever is interested in using psychedelics. Now, one of the things I want to argue today is that the reason why set and setting are so crucial for determining the outcome of psychedelic experiences is because psychedelics enhance our perception of meaning. The literature on psychedelic often talks about this ability of psychedelics to enhance perception of meaning, but it usually refers to it only casually, using other types of terms. So psychedelics have been called amplifiers, magnifiers, augmenters. They have been compared with telescopes or microscopes of the mind. They are said to raise stability. Their effect is said to manifest, to reveal. And all of these names essentially get back to the same idea, the idea of intensification or enhancement of phenomena and their meaning. And this idea has been around since the earliest days of modern psychedelia. In the psychedelic classic, The Doors of Perception, Aldous Huxley describes how everything around him suddenly seems to be laden with significance under the effects of mescaline. And while we're still struggling to unequivocally show that psychedelics are effective in therapy, the ability of these agents to elicit experiences that are experiences deeply meaningful has been resurfacing in the research on psychedelics time and again. And several studies have shown that around 2/3 of the people who take a high dose of psychedelic in a supportive context consider this experience one of the 5 most meaningful experiences of their lives, and around 1/3 consider it the single most meaningful experience that they've had. But this tendency of psychedelics to magnify and enhance meaning and experience is crucial to understanding set and setting. And this becomes obvious when we ask ourselves the question, why do we even speak about set and setting in relation to psychedelics specifically? And I mean, after all, expectation, intention, physical and social environment, all of these things are universally important to our experiences in the world, whether we're going to a birthday party or to a business meeting. And the reason why set and setting are particularly crucial with psychedelics is that with these agents, all of these factors are magnified. All of them are enhanced and made to appear exceedingly more significant. So under the effects of a psychedelic, commonplace insights can seem world-changing, and a passing anxiety can become amplified into a full-blown panic attack. With meaning enhanced, everything seems magnified, amplified, augmented. And this idea of psychedelic as meaning amplifiers brings us to the subject of placebo. When I was writing my paper on the history of set and setting, I became interested in the subject of placebo response. And over the past years, we've been seeing tremendous growth in the study of placebo effects. And what I've wanted to show is how research on set and setting runs parallel to much of the research on placebo response, because both of these phenomena actually speak about extra pharmacological factors, the non-pharmacological factors determining the response to the drug. This is the context to both of these studies of research. And the thing that emerged as I was writing my paper was just how closely these two concepts are related. And studies on placebo response study the impact of the very same parameters that take part in the study of set and setting. And placebo response, for instance, measures, placebo studies, for instance, measure how manipulating expectation or intention changes the degree of placebo response. And these are the same parameters we look at when we study set and setting. Placebo studies also study the effects of physical, social, cultural environment on magnifying or diminishing placebo response. And again, these are the same parameters we talk about when we talk of set and setting. So in fact, these two concepts seem so intricately linked with one another, I started to think they were practically the same. The main differences I could find was that set and setting was more specific. Unlike placebo, it refers to psychedelics specifically. And secondly, placebo was unidimensional, while set and setting seems to be more multidimensional. Placebo studies basically have one parameter. Did the patient get better or did he not get better? Set and setting, on the other hand, is much more multidimensional. It speaks to a whole range of experiences, spiritual, creative, aesthetic, and many other types of experiences. And this relation with, between psychedelics and placebo becomes even more interesting when we insert the concept of meaning enhancement into the picture. And in my examination of the placebo literature, I came across the work of medical anthropologist Daniel Moorman, who argues that the word placebo response is basically a misnomer. It's a misnomer because placebo, by definition, is inactive. It is unable to produce any effect or response. The therapeutic response that patients get from ingesting sugar pills or from having a conversation with a physician is actually a result of the meaning that they attribute to that pill or that treatment. So rather than speak about meaning response, Moorman speaks about, rather than speaking about placebo response, Moorman speaks about meaning response, a response that the patient has to the meaning in the pharmacologically inactive placebo treatment. And this brings us back to the idea that psychedelics enhance meaning. Because if psychedelics enhance our sense of meaning, and if placebo response is basically meaning response, then we can argue that psychedelics enhance meaning response. Or in other words, by enhancing our perception of the significance and meaning, they actually enhance placebo response. They're essentially a kind of super placebo, an agent that augments placebo response. And this could also explain the staggering variety of conditions that seem to be helped by psychedelics, because beyond depression, anxiety, addiction, PTSD, OCD, there is a whole range of reports about psychedelics being effective in treating a plethora of conditions, from stuttering to frigidity, from cancer to allergies. And this evidence is largely anecdotal, but thinking about it through the prism of the super placebo idea can explain a lot of what we're seeing in these reports. Now, this is basically a hypothesis. And in order to prove it, we need more research to really go into the nitty-gritty and find out to what extent and how does use of psychedelics really enhance response to placebo interventions. At the moment, we don't have the necessary evidence, but if we could provide a corroboration that psychedelics perform this service, and it is possible to provide this corroboration, then I would argue this could be a momentous discovery for medicine. Medical science has often looked at placebo as something redundant that needs to be taken out of the picture in order to come to an impartial account of drug effects. And this makes sense because drug companies sell drugs, The justification for taking a pill is that it actually works, not that it's effective in inducing placebo. But really, if we look at the literature, we find that so much of drug efficaciousness is the result of placebo, that very often placebo plays a larger role in clinical trials than the actual drug. Placebo, in other words, is too important to ignore. It might just be the most powerful therapeutic tool we have at our disposal. And if psychedelics are able to universally enhance placebo, this then turns them into true panaceas, agents that are able to help recovery and support health in a variety of different conditions. Now, we can imagine a world where before going to a doctor or undergoing a physiotherapy session, a person microdoses on a psychedelic to enhance their immune response. And this world might still seem far away, but if we think about these subjects more closely, we might discover this is an inescapable, imperative vision with a potential for dramatic gains for medical science across the board. Thank you.
Thank you, Ido, for that fascinating talk. I very clearly remember the first time I read your article on kind of the placebo response, and I don't think there are many articles that I've discussed with so many people over the years. I'm sure there's many questions, and there will be time for a Q&A after this track with both of our speakers, and potentially afterwards also the opportunity to engage with them in breakout rooms. Our second speaker for today, Dr. Mendel Kaelen, is the founder and CEO of WavePaths, a company that researches and develops methods that leverage the psychotherapeutic potential of music. Before starting WavePaths, Mendel worked as a PhD student and postdoc at Imperial College, where he researched the effects of LSD on enhanced closed-eye visuals, and also showed that this includes imagery of an autobiographical nature, which often has been shown to massively work with the therapeutic process. His talk will provide an overview of the latest empirical research into the mechanisms and best practices of how to use music to enhance psychedelic therapy. So Mendel, yeah, really curious to hear your talk. Take it away.
Thank you so much, David, for that introduction. Let me, before I continue, share my screen and check if the video and the sound is all right for everyone. If I'm not, the sound is bad, please let me know. Let me make this full screen. Great. Yeah, David, thanks for that introduction. It was actually really nice to be reminded of how we met at ICPR. It was, I guess, 4 years ago then. And it's great to meet you as well, Ido. I think the last time was in Spain 1 year ago. And I'd just like to congratulate you on your book. That sounds incredibly fascinating, and I'm definitely going to read it. Okay, let's dive into this. I'm going to time myself. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think I got 20 minutes. And before I continue, before I dive into this presentation, I would love to start with this cartoon. After all those years of research, all of us are finally here at, in my opinion, without much doubt, clearly one of the most scientifically excellent conferences that the planet currently has to offer. This is also an ode to the Open Foundation itself. This is a cartoon created by a cartoonist called Margrethe Heer, who created this cartoon in 2010, a conference that I helped to organize. And it's just really amazing to see how the foundation has continued to create these really good conferences. And it's a real pleasure to be here again. And it's really nice to hear that Margrethe is making more cartoons. I didn't realize that. That's really cool.
Sorry to interject, Mendel. You have 15 minutes in total.
15. Oh, that's really
All
good.
right. Good luck.
Thank you. Okay, cool. Let's do this then. Another thing that I wanted to do before I dive into the presentation itself is to say thank you to the team. In 2011, I joined Imperial College London. I studied primarily music and psychedelics, both the neuroscience and the phenomenology and subjective experience of music and psychedelics. And in 2019, I founded WavePaths. And since then, a beautiful team has gathered around this vision. And the vision is primarily taking the core insights of psychedelic therapy, which is that this is not just a drug that we can provide to people. There are certain experiences that are related to positive therapy outcomes. And we are concerned primarily with understanding what kind of experiences they are and how we can facilitate these experiences better, primarily through music. And therefore, we also work together with what we sometimes call the masters of experience. If experience is the foundation for change, we believe that there's a real unique role for artists in the near future of their talents to be leveraged and to be unified in a model that is with nothing more or less concerned than facilitating truly life-changing experiences to people. And in summary, this is really what we aim to do, is to study and develop what the most optimal environments are for psychedelic therapy and beyond psychedelic therapy, and provide and unify these insights into really accessible tools that are designed specifically to enhance the therapy experience and the outcomes for both the care providers and the care seekers. And our current studies so far focus on understanding what therapeutic functions of music there are, how we can personalize music, what kind of information we need to personalize music, both before the session and during the session, and also how we can facilitate psychedelic experiences without psychedelics. And this is also a beautiful link with the really inspiring talk from Ido. What kind of variables, what kind of rituals can be designed to facilitate experiences that are truly psychedelic in the real meaning of the word psychedelic, mind-revealing, soul-revealing experiences. And therefore we study not only music, but also other setting variables like, for example, light. So far, we have an active research program that runs internally. We have supported more than 600 real patient experiences, primarily with ketamine, but also with other psychedelics. And we are supporting an increasing number of clinical trials around the world. The key message of this talk, if I would try to summarize and condense this, is that the psychedelic therapy that is currently being developed with this increasing number of researchers around the world is such a different paradigm of care than we are used to. And that is both its greatest promise and also its greatest challenge. And if you look deeper into this challenge, one of the main messages that I like to give to people that attend this talk is that music plays a very central role, or more precisely, person-centered. Music adapted to the person plays a very important role in order to facilitate experiences that are not only safe, but also really effective. And one of the things I like to do in this talk is to not necessarily go into lots of scientific details itself and statistics itself, but provide a high-level overview of what we have learned so far and really aim to help you think differently about what music is and how we can work with music in psychedelic therapy and again beyond psychedelic therapy. So this slide needs very little explanation. I'm going to skim briefly over this. Mental health care desperately needs innovation. There are a lot of people suffering from mental health problems, and the current therapies are way too inefficient and ineffective for way too many care seekers around the world. And there's a great promise of psychedelic therapy, which brings us all together. And it's important to emphasize that this is not the first wave of psychedelic research. There has been a very significant wave of research that happened in the 50s and 60s. It crashed in the 70s. But we are picking this up, and the clinical trials are showing really promising results. And one of the main things that I'd like to highlight in this slide is not only are the results promising because they are effective, there's something really interesting at play. Patients receive these therapies, these experiences on a small number of occasions, but we see these effects sustained for months and sometimes years. And therefore, this really hints at a very different mechanism of therapy. And this is what brought many people like me together to study this and understand this better. And also rightly so why a lot of new funding is being poured into this field as we speak. And one of the findings that really baffled me from the very beginning when I started to study and get really into understanding psychedelic therapy is one of the things that Ido also mentioned in his talk is that psychedelics often facilitate experiences that are considered one of the most personally meaningful and significant experiences of one entire life. And that is quite something. And not only that, studies at different groups have independently shown that these kinds of experiences, they correlate with positive therapy outcomes. This is just a summary illustration to make the point. This is not real data, but if we look at all these studies that show that peak experiences, for example, correlate to positive therapy outcomes, but the mere drug intensity does not, and other qualities of the experience also don't correlate with this. One way to frame this is to talk more about personal meaning. And one way to understand these experiences, as I will argue, as I will unpack for you over the coming slides, is by looking at this phenomena through the lens of personally meaningful experiences. So the more personally meaningful the experience is, the more symptom reduction we seem to be observing. The more I looked into this, the more I actually came to the conclusion that there's actually not much mysterious going on. This finding has actually really solid foundations in neuroscience. In fact, it's what our brains are programmed to do. And I will explain what I mean with this statement. The brain can be divided in two different learning systems or two different memory systems. The explicit learning system is concerned with recalling semantic knowledge, symbolic knowledge, episodes from the past. But then we also have an implicit learning system, which is concerned with things like procedural learning, conditioning, priming. And a really classic example that I often use is that we can only learn how to ride a bicycle by riding a bicycle. Implicit learning literally means learning through experiencing. And this is one of the most well-studied elements in neuroscience. In fact, Eric Kendall won the Nobel Prize for identifying this mechanism. Now, what does this have to do with psychedelic therapy? One framework that I like to offer to you, one way of thinking about psychedelic therapy is through this lens. Learning by experiencing is basically driving a lot of the memory formations that are subconscious, but that determine a lot of our perceptions about ourselves and the world and our behaviors. And in fact, the emotional learning system of the brain is fully implicit. And this explains why strong experiences with strong personal significance lead to strong outcomes, strong changes. So one way to look at psychedelic therapy is by understanding psychedelic therapy as providing an opportunity for implicit learning experiences to happen that change something much more fundamental, much more subconscious, rather than trying to change molecular structures or behavior like current available therapies do. Psychedelics seem to be working right at the core where learning and change is programmed to happen, literally. In other words, kind of to go back to one of my earlier points, psychedelic therapy represents a very different paradigm of care, a very different type of therapy. And therefore, really important questions for this field are, how can we actually facilitate these experiences? How can we provide the right environments for these experiences to happen? And also, how do we guide altered states of consciousness? We are talking here about a medicine that is able to provide a radically altered state of consciousness that can often be very intense and sometimes quite disorienting as well. So this is a very important question, especially for training new generations of therapists that I am not going into for now, because that's a whole workshop in itself, needless to say. And the more we look into how we can facilitate these ideal experiences for people, the more we recognize that the setting, the environment in which this takes place is absolutely key. Psychedelic therapy is no magic pill. We cannot just provide a medicine like penicillin or paracetamol and expect something to happen. One way to look at psychedelic therapy and frame psychedelic therapy as providing a climate, a favorable climate in which a client, a patient can discover or rediscover and experience in a fully embodied way new aspects of oneself, and thereby engender these implicit learning experiences and these implicit changes in how we perceive ourselves and the world around us. Now, what does it have to do with music? If you look at the image on the right side, this is how most, if not all, psychedelic therapy sessions are currently designed and performed. It happens in an interpersonal context. Patients are carefully prepared by trained psychotherapists. but then for a significant duration, sometimes even the entire duration of the session, patients listen to music with an eye mask. And this was really the starting point of our research, is looking at this and arguing that if you want to understand psychedelic therapy, and if you want to ensure that this is being done in a safe, ethical, and effective way, we need to look at the interaction between music and psychedelics. This brings me, I think, to my almost my second half. One thing to emphasize is that music is not the only variable that is important. I often talk about a synergistic core, 4 elements that interact with each other, that are in synergy with each other, that have a strong influence on what kind of experience the patient may have. They include the medicine, the drug itself, the set and setting, the music, which could be argued to be part of setting, needless to say, just as the interpersonal domain, but I like to emphasize that these are very different and very important setting variables, and the interpersonal elements, of course. Okay, second part. I'm gonna keep this very brief. This is, again, a topic that I could talk about for hours. The history of psychedelics in music is absolutely fascinating. They're both very ancient and universal. All human beings basically make music, and we have been doing this literally for tens of thousands of years, like this slide is showing here. And psychedelics have a very interesting long history as well. And not only that, when we look at traditional use of psychedelics and music, typically they are intertwined. I haven't come across rituals of psychedelic ceremonies that don't use music. Music itself is part of shamanic ceremonies and religious ceremonies all around the world. And when there are psychedelics involved, music is considered to be a very integral component. And this is a quote from a well-known anthropologist that I was delighted to see one name, one virtual conference room to be named after at this conference, Marlene Popkin de Rios, who stated that we could only marvel at the pervasive presence of music in a variety of forms as an integral part of the psychedelic experience. Shamans state that the music they create provokes special types of visions. I'm gonna skip through some slides a little bit quicker. Music came to play a very important part also in the Western world, when the Western world started to get really confused and curious at the same time what these new class of molecules are, how we can work with them. People very soon realized that music is a very powerful way to provide more structure and more influence and more control over the types of experiences that psychiatrists and therapists started to offer. And a lot of really important and pioneering work was done by Helen Bonney, who worked together with Bill Richards, Stan Grof, and others at the Meredith Institute of Psychiatry in Baltimore in the 50s and 60s and the 70s. Okay, so let's get to this question. What is the function of music in psychedelic therapy? What have we learned so far? I'm going to give a really brief overview of some of the studies. Under the influence of psychedelic, music-evoked emotion is significantly intensified. Meaningfulness perceived in the music is enhanced. We are starting to understand some of the brain mechanisms underlying the way music is perceived differently. We have looked at how music and psychedelics literally have a synergy and interaction effect, in the real meaning of the word interaction effect, in driving enhanced vividness, both for personal memories and for mental imagination in general. We are starting to understand some of the predictors for behavior change related to music experiences. And one study that I'd like to emphasize is a study called The Hidden Therapist. That was also really the starting point for starting WavePaths eventually, where we have shown, really for the first time, that there are certain qualities in the music experience that correlate with remissions in depression, whereas drug intensity does not. And you see this on the right side in the image on the bottom right. You also will see on the x-axis different qualities of the experience. And you see that these elements of the music, the liking of the music, the resonance and openness, selectively correlate with peak experiences and autobiographical insightfulness, whereas drug intensity have less of a selective influence on these experiences. And this is really one of the core motivations to include music, to enhance the likelihood of experiences that have therapeutic meaning to occur. And one of the things we have argued in this paper is that there's a real unique role, it seems, for personal resonance, not physical resonance, but the sensation that the music deeply personally resonates with something inside of yourself. People often describe a union between oneself and the music, for example. Okay, I think I'm over time, so that's a pity. I'm gonna quickly skip through a few final slides to make my final point. We can also continue some of these questions in the Q&A. So music seems to be having the important function to provide direction. Music, however, is psychedelic therapy, however, is new and complex. Music is incredibly complex as well. And on top of that, the human beings are complex. And therefore, this is one of the things that you're working on, is asking yourselves, can we integrate all of those findings from neuroscience, psychotherapy research, the immersive arts, creative AI, computational creativity in one unified model that therapists can use. And this is an adaptive music technology that we have developed and are currently beta testing. One way to explain what we're aiming to do here is by using an analogy. And the analogy is what I would argue to be the archetypal musical instruments in shamanism, the rattle. And we believe that our modern age, when we learn how to work with these altered states of consciousness, need a modern equivalent of it, including a musical style, if you wish, that doesn't necessarily have one cultural center, but is truly unique and bespoke for our generation. And I'm going to end here. We are, again, doing lots of research. We're actively beta testing our technologies. We're also building an education platform. If any of this is of interest to you, please visit our website. You can sign up to all these different things. Feel free to email us as well. wave@wavepod.com. And I apologize for going a few minutes over time, but I'm looking forward to take some questions. Thanks, David.
Yeah, thank you, Mendel, for that fascinating overview of the role of music throughout history in relation to psychedelic therapy.
Yeah.
Sorry, Ido, you were gonna.
No.
Guys, there's quite a couple of questions. There's 8 questions, and we have about 8 minutes, so it's going to be tricky. I'm just gonna go democratically by the highest upvoted one. Given the importance of set and setting and of understanding the use of psychedelics as an experience, how does this fit or not fit into our current medical paradigm? Any takers initially? Who would love to field this one?
Yeah, I can take that one. Well, I think, as I say in my talk, the current medical model doesn't really find any place for the question of placebo, because placebo is something to get rid of when you're trying to get at this idea of the actual objective effect of a medicine. And in a sense, I mean, that makes sense, because really what drug companies are in the business of is selling the medicine and not the context. But it also loses sight of the fact that so much of the effect is really a question of the context. So I think what we need to be doing, if we want to think about the therapeutic potential of psychedelics, and not just psychedelics, because set and setting are relevant not just for psychedelics, but for many other agents as well. So what we need to be doing is thinking about how to optimize these agents and how to use them in a way that's how researching how to get the best kinds of results, rather than trying to find some kind of supposedly objective results, which is of course already happening in many ways, but it's part of an ongoing conversation that has to do with, I saw among the other questions, how also paradigms in the pharma industry or in the medical world have to change regarding placebo and its role, that have complicated the history of also the psychedelic renaissance. And Matthew Orum's book has been mentioned, and the problem, an inherent problem that exists between in the question of placebo and its role in psychedelic medicine, that is going to keep accompanying us in the years to come. And I think we need to give nuanced answer to.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think that yeah, it's definitely something we need to focus on in the future, and requires quite a big paradigm shift. I'm personally also really curious about how we can kind of research some of these kind of long held beliefs kind of more empirically, because while we kind of all are in agreement around the importance of this, kind of the field at large is not nearly there yet. And I think that we have a road ahead of us in that regard. Yeah, just jumping into the next question, given that we don't have that much time, Mendel, lots of people really seem to want to know, when you make a music playlist, how do you decide on what music to incorporate? Is there a special sauce involved?
It's a question I often get, and it's such a large question. Like I literally can't answer that in a few sentences. That was actually my final few slides. Music is super complex in itself. Psychedelic therapy is quite complex in itself. Psychotherapy is complex. The human mind is complex. Human beings are complex, and this is what we're trying to solve. But I can, without disappointing too many people, I can kind of give a few generic answers to this question. One of the things that is becoming very clear is that because every single person brings a unique story and a unique way of responding to music, to those sessions, that we need to start with the person. Music is a nonverbal language, and it's a universal nonverbal language in the same way that language is a universal thing, but it doesn't mean that everyone speaks the same language. Let me unpack that. If I see a psychotherapist, I would prefer the therapist to be Dutch or English and not Chinese, for example, because I don't speak Chinese. And I would argue that a very similar thing, and there's lots of research to back this up, is the case for our natural inclinations to music. So if I would be doing psychedelic therapy for a patient, for example, that for her entire life listened only to classical music, it doesn't make any sense to play electronic ambient music for that person, because the person would feel completely alienated, unacknowledged, and all those things that we exactly want to avoid for those sessions. So starting with the person, then you have the medicine with the unique pharmacodynamics of the medicine with different stages. Really roughly speaking, we can identify different functions for these stages. But then most importantly, again, the person is going on a journey that is personal. So whatever therapeutic process is presenting itself, there is a question of how that process can be best supported, with or without music. Not all people need music, and I would argue some people are better off without music. We should not conclude that we should fill sessions with music entirely. It's a powerful tool that can completely make or break the experience. And if it's used accurately, it can be absolutely transformative and life-changing. But it completely depends on what's happening in the mind of the individual. And so for that reason, I avoid easy answers like classical music is the best, or ambient music is the best, or it depends on a lot of different variables. And a lot of these musical songs I like to view as musical worlds. And therefore, the question as a therapist, what kind of world, what kind of climate, what kind of journey do we want to provide? What kind of direction do we want to provide for this particular individual?
Thank you, Mendel. I love the complex, non-complex answer. I think that really is the way to go. Floris, quick question. Do we have time to potentially go over? Because it is now 10 minutes. No, we do not. I see Joost doing, 2 minutes. We got one question, 2 questions, potentially. All right. 2 questions.
Official permission.
Oh, thanks, Joost. That means a lot. The 2 most upvoted questions are somewhat similar, really around kind of, do you guys think that simultaneous pharmacological and placebo effects can occur regarding psychedelics? And same as Felix's question, kind of around the paradoxical aspect of the super placebo effect. Ido, could you maybe speak on that a bit?
Well, I think those 2 things definitely can overlap, and I mean, there's so much so many levels on which psychedelics are active, and I wouldn't want to my point to be interpreted as psychedelics are just super placebos. Obviously, they're doing so much more in so many different lines of therapy for so many conditions. So I think there's definitely a level on which that happens on many different levels, and then there's the placebo aspect that enters into the picture, and that we need to find a way to better measure, tease out, understand.
Yeah, I agree. I think also like some of the confusion maybe around kind of the semantic aspect of like the placebo as psychedelics as a placebo, or the enhancing of the placebo effect of the setting, so to say, right? Do you agree?
Right, and psychedelics are not a placebo. That definitely isn't the case, but they might have this ability of enhancing our innate tendency to experience placebo. And if that is the case, since placebo is the broadest medical curative effect that is known to medicine, then really that is a game changer to my mind.
Couldn't agree more, definitely. All right, final question. Mendel, there's quite a lot of upvotes for this one as well. How do you feel about using guided visualization journeys or hypnosis in combination with music? Have you looked into this at all with wave paths?
I love that question. I just want to acknowledge the history around this first, because a lot of earlier psychedelic research pioneers were actively looking into this. You got Hans Karl Lohner, for example, in Germany, who's the founder of guided imagery therapy, born out of psychedelic research, who developed a lot of really interesting guided imagery techniques, and this became, of course, a very well-known field. Helen Bonney worked with music of psychedelic therapy in the 50s and 60s, developed this whole method out of it called guided imagery and music, which is focusing on music itself without psychedelics. So music itself has what I refer to as psychedelic properties in the real meaning of the word. It has capacity to activate subconscious content, and like in psychedelics, that content has all sorts of symbolic archetypal expressions. So having certain frameworks at hand as a therapist, working needless to say with psychedelics and music is very helpful to understand that. We are currently not actively looking into imagery at this moment, but it's something that's definitely on our research agenda. But we have studied this at Imperial. We've published several papers on mental imagery and music and the neuroscientific mechanisms underlying that. Yeah. This is the interesting thing about psychedelics. They enhance the imagery with music in a very profound way, and there's this real interaction, which makes them a very unique combination. Yeah.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Especially like you mentioned earlier, the autobiographical aspect of that personally meaningful kind of history that is elicited by music can be so powerful in kind of shaping the effects.
Totally. Yeah.
Oh, gentlemen, I would love to continue further. Do we have time for one more, Joost? Do we have permission for one final question? Because it
Really?
might be a very interesting one.
Really?
Yeah, I'm just going to push it. I'm just going to see. Right. Okay. Because I'm actually, like, Mendel, this is sadly another one for you, sadly. I'm really curious about this because we've discussed this. Do you feel that there is potentially kind of too much of a focus currently on Western composed ambient background music that is meant to not really be intrusive? We've spoken as well about kind of the not using like lyrics that people can understand specifically for that reason. Yeah, could you speak to that really briefly?
So one of the okay, where to start? So there's a few things that come up. One is that I often, and I didn't do it in this talk, but I often emphasize that when we talk about music and psychedelics, we're not talking about background music. Music has an active therapeutic role to play. We can use music, we say, as background music. That could be one function of music to create a more calm, peaceful atmosphere to begin a session or whatever. But I'm not aware of any psychedelic therapist that just plays ambient music on the background for the entire session. Not to say that may not be good for certain patients, but I'm not aware that that's kind of the standard thing to do for a lot of people. The reason why I started with creating playlists was a response to playlists that were available at that moment, which were primarily developed in the 50s and 60s and were completely filled up with Western classical music. And I realized that this would probably be for a lot of people a really good playlist, but for another group, totally not. Because listening to 6 hours of Wagner and Mozart can be quite intense. And again, it may not be the language, the musical language that you're exposed to. And also, this is the final thing I want to say, because this again is a whole thing in itself. This is actually a really good point. When we talk about music, I often emphasize that in the use of music in psychedelic therapy, I often emphasize that when therapists talk about psychedelic therapy being non-directive, I disagree completely. The very fact that we give people a medicine that enhances suggestibility and the super placebo effects or whatever makes people very vulnerable and open to sensory stimuli. And then we play very emotionally evocative music on top of it. Makes it a directive form of therapy. And there's nothing wrong with that. I actually think that this is one of the opportunities because some people need more direction, a bit more of a push. But what I aim to say here, to conclude here, is that it's not about being directive or not directive. It's about the degree of direction, and it's about the type of direction. And that's one framework that we also use within our work to view music. And therefore, background music can be great for some, and other people need more emotionally evocative, cinematic, classical, electronic music. It's that balancing act, that the decision tree that the therapists are constantly working with.
Thank you, Mendel. As much as I would love to continue questions, I see they're still coming in even now. Well, we've already passed the last question. Yeah, I think we have to close it off. I'm going to hand it over to Joost, but you guys can contact both. Hey, it's Lior. Both Ido and Mendel via our Whova apps if you guys want to send some more questions. Who knows if they'll be available to field them. But thank you both so much for your talks, for being here, for answering all of these questions. I'm going to pass it back to our fearless leader Joost to continue and close off for today.
Yeah, thank you, David. Yeah, in fact, you can ask Mendel and or Ido to create a meetup room in the Whova community board. I feel like I'm promoting Whova all the time, but this is actually a good way to interact with Mendel and Ido directly. If you go and create a meetup room, you can create a small room that you can use with, I think, 30 people to continue asking questions. Basically the equivalent of them coming off stage and you mobbing them with all the questions that you didn't get a chance to ask during the presentations. Thank you very much, David. It's a pity that you're not standing here right next to me. Thank you for pushing the envelope a little bit. This is the one time in the program that we're able to do this. I'm looking directly at my camera. Behind my camera, it's all black. It's almost 10:30 p.m. here in Amsterdam. So it feels kind of normal, but I also realized that this is a conference, the first day of the conference that is ending in the middle of the night. This is the case for us here in Western Europe. It may be different from for where you are. I also wanted to acknowledge, given that we were talking about setting, that we had panelists, 3/4 of whom were actually Dutch, but based in Switzerland, Portugal, Israel, and the Netherlands. So it's very nice to have people present from different places. Nice surprise appearance by Lior, by the way, as well. I just wanted to mention that. And lovely campfire in the background, David. Very nice. So I had a wonderful day. It flew by. Luckily, there's much more to explore. Tomorrow, we'll start the day, before the presentations start, we'll start the day with an embodiment circle, which has a limit. So there will be space for about 100 people. I think 100 people exactly max. So if you want to join the embodiment circle, be there early. It's first come, first serve. We're also screening Trip of Compassion again tomorrow morning. Morning. You'll have to look at the agenda for the exact times because this will depend on where you are, obviously. And tonight we'll go out in style. When this recording is over, you can click on the next agenda item, which will be a musical journey graciously provided to us by WavePods, which will be a 45 to 1 hour immersive musical journey. And I think on that note, no, there's one more thing that I wanted to mention, which is that we have satellite events happening in 3 cities, in Amsterdam, in Helsinki, and Berlin. We still have a couple of spaces left for people who want to attend in person to get the real conference feeling. Tomorrow here in Amsterdam, at Plek across the Eye. It's a beautiful space. It's COVID friendly. It's COVID safe, I should say. So please let us know if you want to join that. And on that note, I would like to finish by thanking Ido again. Ido was doubting a little bit whether he would present at an online conference. I hope you didn't regret it. I certainly enjoyed it very much. Mendel, it's lovely to see you again. It's always wonderful to have you. David, same for you, man. I wish you were standing right here next to me. David was part of our organizational team, was part of the program team, and he played a big role in putting together this conference. So with a final word of thanks to my wonderful, wonderful, wonderful team. Many of you are sitting downstairs right here and upstairs doing the tech support. Maybe you can pick up the screaming, the cheering. Thank you very much. It's been wonderful. I hope to see you all back tomorrow for day 2 of ICPR. Good night, good afternoon, and good morning, perhaps, for some.
Thank you.